Welcome to Voices of the Gascoyne, the podcast series where we delve into the remarkable stories of the pastoralists who came before us. These men and women face their fair share of challenges, from day-to-day aspects of communication, transport and electricity, to natural disasters, market collapses, and the impacts of government policy. In this series, we reflect on their journeys and capture insights that can only be gained from having made it to the other side. You'll hear stories of their unacknowledged resilience. For them, it was simply life, but for us, it serves as both inspiration and a chance to learn for the future. Voices of the Gascoyne is a Gascoyne Catchments Group project made possible through support from FRRR's Helping Regional Communities Prepare for Drought initiative, funded by the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund. In this episode, we speak to Tim and Chris Darcy from Lyndon Station. Tim Darcy's childhood on Lyndon Station was full of adventure and freedom. Accompanied by friends and mentors from the local Aboriginal community, he developed a love of the land and a dream to own his own station one day. And, with the help of his wife, Tim would make that dream come true several times over. Today, Lyndon Station has been under the care of the Darcy family for over 90 years. To start our conversation, I asked him to share the story of how his father came to be on Lyndon.
Dad was a 17-year-old when he went to the First World War. He had to bring his age back. He was a 17-year-old, but you're supposed to be an 18-year-old to go to the war, but Dad changed his name because he felt he had to go to the war to represent Australia and what have you. Then when he was in battles in France, he was renowned, and I can't think of the name of the place now, one of the major points in France. He became injured. He was on a gun carriage, five guys on a gun carriage late one night. A bunch of horses were towing the wagon up through a muddy field, and they got a direct hit by a what was rocket in those days, or it was a gun that exploded and killed all the other guys except Dad on board, so he was a sole survivor. But he got injured out of that, and he had to go back to England and spent quite a bit of time in England. And then he back to the fields again and continued to fight until the end of the war. Then he went back to England and completed his wool classing degree, which he'd started when he was injured. 6 months in England that period, then came back to Australia. Before he went over there, he was a footballer that played for South Melbourne, which is these days is Sydney. Came back to Melbourne from the war, and he continued to play with them for 2 years. His dad, by the way, had died when Dad was only 4 years of age. So he had a guardian. His mum's great friend was a fellow called A.L. Baillieu, who was one of the Baillieu family, that were one of the major kings of Melbourne in those days. She was a great friend of and so A.L. became Dad's guardian. So after 2 more years in Melbourne playing football after the war, A.L. said to him, Lang, he said, you better think about heading west. The wool industry is becoming the big issue in Australia these days. And he said the best place to go to learn the wool industry is to go to West Australia and jackaroo through properties in West Australia. So he did. And first place he went to was Woolleen Station under the Sharp family. And he spent quite a bit of time there, I think about 3 years, learning the game. Then after that, he became available to be managing, and he was sought after as manager for initially Yinathara Station in the East Gascoyne. Then after that, he went Mount Phillip, which was next door to Yinathara on the north side, and then he took over the management from there of Bidgimire Station, and he was only there for about 6 months because they had a bit of a problem with the people that owned Bidgimire, because they were a Victorian family that had some association with a questionable industry. And then he was offered the job of managing Lyndon back in 1932. And so he took over that management, and there he was for the rest of his life.
Your father started managing Lyndon in the early 1930s,
Yep.
which is before you were but a twinkle in his eye at that time.
Yeah.
What do you remember of his stories?
The Aboriginal industry was highly regarded by my father, and they're very, very reliant on the people and had a lot of respect for them. And that's why my great mentor was Donald Willering, who was one of Dad's right-hand men for quite a while. And I got many good stories about old Donald Willering, my Aboriginal guy who was my mentor, and over the years taught me all the tricks there are about living in the bush. Donald had a cousin. There was another guy, Aboriginal guy called Yarji, who was there at the time, and Yarji had a brother called Wallady. Wallady was a guy who worked on the station with everybody, and he was the sad story about Wallady. He went out with Ambrose Hay, who's in that photo, who was Dad's overseer, to Eclipse Well on Lyndon, and they were pulling the column. And back in those days, they were the deep 3.5-inch column, heavy columns, and you pull your rods out of the columns. Anyhow, he pulled all the rods out, repair the pump and what have you, and stacked all the column rods on the side of the windmill, and then he wanted to shift the bearers on which the steel column was sat on. He wanted to shift the column, so he hooked that up through a pulley system to the truck to lift it and shift it into place. Wallady, who should never have been standing on one of the cross bearers, when the truck let it back down and dropped it a bit quickly onto the crossbearer, and the crossbearer broke, and Wallady went down the well, heading down the well, but as he went down, he reached out and grabbed one of the rods on the side of the mill, and the rod came down through him. And when Wallady hit the bottom of the well, the rod went through him. Anyhow, one thing led to another. Ambrose brought him back in. Now, I would have been only 3 years of age, and I can remember when Ambrose arrived back in the truck with Wallady on the back, and they pulled up on the front veranda of Lyndon. They came in the driveway and pulled up there, and I remember Mum, and I can still remember this, trying to bandage Wallady's gut because all his gut was coming out through the hole that had been made by the rod. And so she patched him up as best she could. And then Ambrose took our old Buick 8 car with Wallady in it and headed to Carnarvon to the doctor. And anyhow, needless to say, when Wallady got to Carnarvon, he was still alive apparently, but went onto the table and while he was being operated, he died. So it's a very sad story about Wallady. He was a wonderful guy and, upset Mum and Dad quite substantially.
There's no shortage of stories about how dangerous windmills were, but that's one a scenario I hadn't come across before. And I just wonder how Ambrose got him out.
He did. Well, because they had that was an interesting story, because you have the pulley system, which you lift the column with. Ambrose himself extended the column, the wire down to the bottom of the thing. He climbed down himself. Ambrose climbed down the column, hooked Wallady up with the pulley system that the truck was pulling up, was able to pull him up with a couple of straps that he had, and he pulled him up with the truck through the pulley system and pulled Wallady to the surface. Actually, it was a fantastic job that Ambrose did.
Just shows how incredibly brave people were back then, because
he had no option.
Well, he could have gone down and got stuck himself, and
absolutely,
when would somebody have come to get them? I mean, I wouldn't have blamed him if he'd said, stay there, I'm going to go get help and come back. But he just was like, no, I'm going to rescue myself and put myself in harm's way.
Or he could have just thought, oh, well, I can't do anything, and jumped in the truck and driven home and told Dad about it.
Yeah.
But instead of that, he went down the well himself on the column, on the 3.5-inch column, climbed down that, to get down to Wallardy and take the rope down with him, the rope that's connected to the truck through the pulley, take that down with him and a couple of straps and to wrap round Wallardy and then hook
and he
him
had
onto
to
the
climb
wire.
back out the well himself.
And then he had to climb back out, yep. And
wow.
Yeah. But if you have a look at that photo of Ambrose, he was pretty fit sort of bloke. He was actually used to ride racehorses. He was a very fit jockey type of guy.
And so I understand that growing up, the Aboriginal community on the station or around the station was such a big part of your childhood and your family's life.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I had nobody else, but I didn't know any other white kids until I was probably, when I went to school at 9 years of age. So they were all my mates. Yeah, one of the things we used to do, the old Aboriginal camp, they'd have a corroboree every 2 or 3 weeks. They'd have a bit of a corroboree. So I joined into the corroborees, and one of the old guys over there used to get emu tail feathers and stick on my backside, and I had to do a corroboree job with all these feathers hanging off. I can remember that as about a probably 5 or 6 year old, but it was all part of the deal. We were part of the whole community. Everybody was, we were all sort of mates and worked together, and my dad had a great relationship with the Aboriginal people. They loved him, actually, and and we paid them pretty good money in those days too. There was none of this business where they were ripped off and that sort of thing. Well, Donald and I, when we used to go out and do the boundary ride, we always had a .22 rifle with us, and we never took much in the way of food. Take a bit of flour because you could make little hot cakes on the fire and that sort of thing, on the open fire. But the other thing that was interesting at that time, and people don't believe me when I tell them the story, but we'd shoot a kangaroo, and then we'd pull the gut out of the kangaroo, empty the gut, and we always just take a few bits of potatoes and onions and that type of thing. Always took a bit of that. But by the time when you shot a kangaroo and you took the gut out of the kangaroo and emptied all the rubbish out of the gut, cleaned the gut out, and then chucked a bit of other meat and potatoes and a bit of onion and things back into that gut, screw it all off, and that sort of thing, and cook that gut in the fire. And that was our stew that we used to make out in the bush.
So the gut of the kangaroo acted as sort of like a pot to cook in.
Yep. And you'd put everything into it, and then old Donald would have the fire, and you'd sort of half bury, once the fire burnt down to ash, you'd have to dig a bit of a hole in the ash and you'd bury that gut in the ash, and you'd cook for a couple of hours, and that was the dinner you'd have, and some of the bloody good food, very tasty.
So it was the original camp oven.
Yeah, that's basically what it was. People don't even believe you could do that in these days when you talk to people.
I would just assume the gut would burn or burn to a crisp.
No.
There you go.
And so It
sounds like a very free childhood.
Well, you didn't know anything else. We didn't know anything else. I mean, that was life. And I was just fortunate enough that probably one of the better and more knowledgeable Aboriginal guys that were in the area became my mentor and taught me everything. And when he died, as a point of interest, he was 98 years of age when he died, and he had a few belongings. He'd already left the station and gone to live in Carnarvon because of his health factor and that sort of thing. When he died, I had a phone call from the Aboriginal community chief in Carnarvon, that sort of thing. He'd left all his belongings to myself and my sister. So, we were a pretty close family almost, yeah.
What was it like for you then when you had to go away to boarding school, also at the age of 9, which is quite young?
Yep.
And you go from this life of freedom with just your family really as the only other white people and all your Aboriginal friends down to a very different environment in the city.
Yeah, it wasn't easy. But however, there were other kids that were doing the same thing, so we got to be mates at a fairly early age. We, strange as it may seem, today kids go to boarding school and they're very protected. They're sort of very carefully looked after and all that sort of thing. One of the first things we did when we got to school, I remember the school, they used to have, after you'd been there for a month, they'd get all the young kids together and they'd have boxing ceremonies. And we'd get in a room or we'd get into a ring. You'd be put in a ring with one of the other guys and you'd belt the hell out of each other and until it was over and done with. But you became mates because of that.
So this happened to kids in all year groups. So you went in at age 9 and a month later, the school was pitting 9-year-olds against each other.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, talk about different times.
Well, it was. I mean, I don't think all kids would agree to want to do it. And that's the thing. You had the option. If you didn't want to do it, well, you didn't do it. But if you wanted to get in there and belt that crust out of each other, well, yeah.
Did you enjoy going to school?
Yeah, I did. I was very into sport. And I loved being competitive and playing sport, and sport got me through school, enjoying school, I think. And I was lucky. I was a pretty good runner. I was probably the fastest guy in school at 100 yards and all that sort of thing, and 200 yards. And so all those sort of things was the luck of the draw.
You ended up leaving school early though. How did that come about?
Well, my sister, who was 5 years younger than me, she had to go to school, and Dad in those days couldn't afford the fees for both me and my sister. So I had to leave school so my sister could come down and go to school. And, that was one of the saddest days of my life then, because, I was loving school and I loved my sport and it was a bit sad actually. But however, that's one of the things in life that happens to you, and
So you left school in grade 10, which is, as you said, was earlier than you wanted to.
Yep.
What was the plan after that?
Well, really, I didn't have any other plan. I didn't come back to the station, jackarooed my way through basically learning the trade, and country week cricket was a big deal because we had a very good team. When we first started, we were playing in C grade, Norwestern Merchiston Cricket Association, playing in C grade. And then I had great friends, in George Gooch, who was one of the better cricketers in West Australia in those days. He was a renowned spin bowler, and he and I were very good. I was an opening bowler, a fast bowler. We got our Norwestern Merchiston cricket side up into the A grade, and one year we almost won it.
Sounds like country week cricket was an important part of the social scene. What else was there for you to do in your childhood and early years?
Well, I was into the horse industry quite a bit. I used to ride races for various people, and also I finally had horses of my own that I went in. I rode a horse at the Onslow races. I was one of the leading jockeys in that stage, and I rode a horse there called the Idler, in which we won the Onslow Cup in. But I used to ride a horse called Mercury for Bob Sharp, and probably one of the best and fastest horses I've ever seen or heard of. I won every race on Mercury. He was just most incredible horse, and Mr. Sharp used to get me to ride him wherever it was, and we won a number of races on him. When the junction races were on, we had an arrangement where the people at Maroona, which are 42 k's further east of where we are, people from there would ride their horses to Lyndon. They would join with us, and we'd have a couple of horses that we would join together, and then we'd ride those through to Williambury, and we'd probably overnight at Williambury. Then we'd go through to Muggery, and we'd overnight in Muggery, and we'd pick up more horses from Williambury and Muggery as well. Then finally to Mount Sandeman. I think that was about the fourth night or something we were joined the horse. By this stage, we had probably 10 or 12 horses. And the people that were riders and then we'd ride those horses through to get to Junction for the race meeting and then the gymkhanas afterwards. One of the interesting stories about that was one night at the Mount Sandeman, and I just got myself a watch. Didn't have a watch in those early days, but I had just got this watch, and the guy that was in charge of or considered himself be in charge of our operation, he said to me, "Okay, you guys," he said, "we need to leave. We got to be up at 4 o'clock, and we need to leave at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning to get to the junction tonight. Otherwise, because it's a 50-kilometre 50-kilometre ride down there. Anyhow, I set my watch, and when it came to at 5 o'clock, I looked at my watch. 5 o'clock, good Lord, and I woke everybody up, and we got up and we put the billy on the fire and got the billy boiling. And after about an hour and a half, we were waiting for the sun to come up, but the sun didn't appear. And I realised, as I looked at my watch again, it had been 12:05 when
I bet you were popular
and
that
I wasn't
day.
terribly popular with the mob at that stage.
Sounds like an absolute journey just to get from home, for everyone to get from home to the races.
Oh,
though.
absolutely.
Were these the same horses that they would use they would be the same horses you'd race and put in the gymkhana?
No, there weren't many races. There was the odd racehorse amongst it, but most of us were just gymkhana type ponies and horses.
How far do you think, if that final stretch was 50 kilometres, how far would the whole trip from Lyndon have been to Junction?
150.
Your poor horse would be buggered by the time you get there. It's saying, I don't want to run around some poles or
they used to.
flag.
Whenever we stayed where we stayed at night, you'd hobble the horses out, and usually you'd find somewhere where you had a creek or something with plenty of good buffalo grass on it and plenty of good grass and that sort of thing. Just hobble the horses out on that area and pick them up first thing in the morning, and away you go again.
And would riding that distance in such a short period of time, a couple of days, cause everyone to be quite sore? Because then you'd have to turn around and do it the whole way home. Or were you so used to living in a saddle?
No, we lived on horses. There's no way you ever got sore and that sort of thing.
I understand you have a whole vault of stories from your childhood. I know there's a couple of people and particular stories that you wanted to share in this recording that really stand out to you. Do you want to share some of those?
Well, probably one of the greatest characters that we're knowing all through the Gascoyne area was Count Raymond John Charles MacDonald of the Isles, and he always announced himself as that, Count Raymond John Charles MacDonald of the Isles. And everybody thought he was just a bit of a joke and sort of laughed at him quite a bit and that sort of thing. But he was the most fascinating character. He was very English, well, he was actually Scottish, but he was very English in his accent and what have you. And quite often when we're sitting around campfires at night, he would tell us stories about the war and what things, and prior to the war, all things that happened in Scotland and the Orkney Islands and all sort of thing, and England and what have you. And most of us listened, but we sort of thought, a fair bit of rubbish that the old Count's cooking up and that sort of thing. Having said that, he told it very effectively. Many years later, after Chris and I were married, I did a trip. And she and I did a trip to England and up through Scotland, the Orkney Isles. And while I was in Scotland at one particular place, I were one night drinking with some local people and that sort of thing. And I said, we had a character from Scotland that used to work for us back in the station. There used to be a camp cook in those days. We were a bit of a piss tank, so we had to keep him sort of, we weren't allowed to have any grog in the camp and that sort of thing. And he used to tell us all these stories at night. And a guy said, what was his name? I said, his name was Count Raymond John Charles MacDonald of the Isles. And this bloke stood upright. He said, I know the character. He said, he's a renowned character here in Scotland. And he said, if he's telling you stories, he said, you better believe it, because he knows more of what went on in this area and those through the war years and prior to. And that was the most fascinating story. And it changed my whole life thinking about the old Count, because, and most of the people today that would read this would suddenly realise they knew the Count, but they didn't know this story. So he was quite a fascinating character, actually.
It's just amazing to think of the people that you would find out in the middle of nowhere. Yep. The most amazing people, all different walks of life that have lived some incredibly hard lives and brave lives, and the things they've done and seen. Yeah. And they've all ended up out in the middle of the outback on Lyndon. Yeah.
Well, I think you've got to understand that a lot of those people got destroyed mentally in their younger years. And a lot of them probably found the solution to it was turn to alcohol. And the old Count, he was just a total piss tank. I mean, whenever he got to town, that sort of thing, he'd go in with a fairly big check, and within about 2 weeks or a bit less than that, somebody'd ring you up and say, I'm out of money, boss, can I come back out again? And, it was a fascinating story, but a guy that I had the utmost respect for. And
was he a good cook?
He was a very good cook. He was brilliant. Around the fire, he would camp. Some of this food that he would camp he would make for you were just unbelievable.
What was an average camp meal back in the, 40s, 50s, 60s?
Predominantly, mostly they were a stew of some kind, a pot stew or something like that. Occasionally, if you happened to kill a sheep or something out there you normally kill sheep when you're out on the camp anyhow, but if something broke its leg or something, you had to kill a sheep and that sort of thing. He would get the leg off and cook a roast and do all that sort of thing. But you always had supplies of potatoes and onions and a few tin veggies we used to have. We didn't have any real veggies out there in the bush in those days. But
so sort of a meat and potato damper and tea kind of situation, no fresh.
Yep.
Did people get sick? Like, did you have scurvy or Baku rot or anything go through the camp?
Always very healthy out in the camp. So particularly when you had the old count around, you had very good meals. But it was, always an interesting life.
Who else have we got on this list of stories?
Yeah, George Roberts. George Roberts is a renowned character. George was a part Aboriginal, one of the most highly respected characters, black or white, in the whole of the region. He was renowned as a dog. He used to specialise in trapping dogs because in those days with sheep you couldn't afford to have any dogs alive. They had to be all trapped and killed. And George was very successful at it and made a name for himself. And he was highly respected throughout the whole community. He was one of those guys, one of the most big and powerful men I know. He was one guy, and I tell the story, that with 2 hooks could hook onto either end of a bale of wool with the 2 hooks, lift it up onto his knee. This is a 300-pound bale of wool onto his knee and put it up into the back of a utility. Now, you tell me people that you could find today that could do that sort of thing. He was a huge, big, powerful man, George. But the story that I had with George was catching a dingo. And this particular dingo was in an area about 3 or 4 k's west and southwest of Lyndon Homestead. And I'd been trying to catch the dog for years, and every time I'd go set a trap, I'd go back a couple of days later and the trap had been set off. And I just got that frustrated. I got on to George and I said, George, can you come and give me a hand? There's a dog here causing a lot of trouble. He's killing sheep and killing lambs and what have you. Give me a hand to catch this dog. So George came over and he said, okay. He said, we'll try. He said, he set a trap off too, and he was very good at setting his traps. Sure as hell. They go out the next day and the trap's been set off. And so George said to me, he said, I'll tell you what, he said, he did that a couple of times and the trap got set off. And this got George quite frustrated because he was a renowned dogger. And he said, I'll tell you what we do. He said, down there, Quail Springs, where you've got that bush place there where there's a bit of bush. He said, what about we set the trap there right next to the bush, and back in the bush a little bit, we put the 22 rifles, we put it on a couple of star posts, and we point it back over the top of the trap. And we put the string back onto the trap and onto the trigger. And he said, when he come in tomorrow night and he set the trap off, he shoot himself. And so, sure as hell, we came to that. We said, yeah, I think that's a hell of a good idea, Georgia. We did that. Anyhow, for the next 3 nights, we go back out there and trap hadn't been set off. And so we got very frustrated about all of that. And finally, George said, yeah, look, no good. He said, I can't. He's too good for us, so we can't catch that dog, sort of thing. So he decided he'd give it away and go back. He'd go back to Maroona and that sort of thing. But he said to me, he said, we're driving around one day, and he said, oh, see that place there where that bit of spinifex and a big circle and a bare patch in the middle? He said, see the horse been in there walking around and then pissing in there. And he said, I tell you what, we set a trap there. He said, you never know, he might come back one day. And that's so he'd given up hope of catching this dog. And now we set the trap in there, and I used to go past it regularly every 2 or 3 or 4 days. About 2 or 3 weeks I went past it one day, and all of a sudden the trap's gone. And I said, oh, what's happened? And then I got up and I was where the dog had actually been caught in, and I thought it was just another dog that's gone in there because we'd set a bit of a bait there as well, And anyhow, tracked it up, and here was the dog that we'd been after, and he'd lost. He was caught in his right hand leg, and the reason he was never caught before, that he'd definitely been caught before, he'd lost his foot. So he was clever enough when he'd go to a trap and knew all the bait that was on there. So he was too clever, so you couldn't get him to. So he used to just set the trap off with his right foot. So we learnt the story why that dog was so clever. He'd been caught before, but he'd got away from it because the people that had caught him didn't put the strychnine on the jaws like you're supposed. If you put strychnine on them, when they get caught, they eat the strychnine and kills them straight away. So he'd been caught in a trap that didn't have strychnine on it, and he got so clever. So we found it, and old George, even George, who was, he was a guy, part Aboriginal guy, he didn't believe in any stories like this, but he said that's one of the best stories he'd ever known about. So there you go. That was the old dingo. The other guy was Danny Burgess. We used to be camped out in the bush a lot. Prior to that, he was from a lady that had cared for him in most of his life, but he didn't know who his mother or his father was. He didn't have a clue. And he was one of those guys, he just didn't have any think about other people much. He said, he'd never learnt much in life about other people and the things he had to do and that sort of thing. And one night at Lyndon, we were camped out in the bush, and we'd been camped out for quite a while, but we're mustering sheep, and we're gone and got into our swags. I don't know, we used to get in the swags by about 7 o'clock at night and that sort of thing because you had nothing else to do. And all of a sudden a light appeared over the horizon, and it was my mum and dad had coming out in the car to where we were camped, which is about probably 12 k's from the homestead at that stage. And Mum got out of the car and she shouted out, "Danny, where are you? Where are you, Danny?" Danny said, "Oh, I'm here, Mrs. Darcy, I'm here." She said, "Well, come over here." And he went over to the car, and Mum presented him with this beautiful round cake and said, "Happy birthday, Danny." Mum had done a research on him and found out his birthday and everything else. He didn't even know he had a birthday. Anyhow, it shocked Danny to the degree it changed his whole life from being nobody in life, from nowhere. Suddenly, somebody cared for him. And he, as I say, then he worked for us for 3 years through that period, and then he went and became Cadet of the Year for Australia in his first year after leaving us and going and joining the army. But he was renowned for one of the guys who found the Vietnamese launch pads that were being set up to take out the Australian camp in Vietnam.
I wonder if your mother knew when she was baking that cake, probably in an old wood stove at that point in time, that cake could have such an impact on the trajectory of someone's life.
Well, no, she probably didn't, but I tell you what, the fact was that when my mum died, Dan was one of the blokes that he turned up at a funeral, and he was mortified because she was his mother, effectively, because she'd changed his whole perspective of life. And then later on, when my dad died, he came to that funeral, and I remember him standing up and telling people at that funeral what my dad and mum had done to his life and had changed his life from being nobody to suddenly he was a fairly important character in life that had married and had kids of his own. And, incidentally, after he came back from the war in Vietnam, he became captain of the Perth Fire Brigade for God knows how many years. So he became quite a character in life. And he all puts that back to Mum bringing him the cake for his birthday when he's camped out in the bush.
Again, it just seems that Lyndon is such a magnet for these characters that have either had amazing lives beforehand or afterwards.
Well, you didn't know most of the times when you're employing people and that sort of thing. And there are other people that we had that were, fascinating characters that had been to the war and that sort of thing. And most of them had some pretty fascinating stories. But yeah, it's just what happened, I guess. Yeah.
Now, you've been saving one story for last. Tell me about Jimmy Crow.
Well, Jimmy Crow was a young Aboriginal guy working at Bidgymire Station. The owner of Bidgymire, and we won't have any names, was a fairly well-known Victorian, or had Victorian criminal history behind him, and he wasn't the nicest person by all accounts. But Jimmy was working for him. Jimmy was quite renowned. He was one of the few people that could draft five-way draft for sheep drafting. And for people, anybody that knows anything about sheep drafting these days won't believe you, because everybody says, well, no, you can only draft 3 ways. Jimmy, apparently renowned, he could draft 5 ways, and he was and he was only a young guy, probably 21, 22, something like that. Anyhow, this guy wanted to buy Jimba Jimba Station, which is next door, and belonged to the Vivash family. Old Mr. Vivash had died, and the Bidgemeyer guy wanted to buy Jimba Jimba and tack it on to Bidgemeyer, and it would have been that much bigger. So it would have been over 1 million acre property altogether. Mrs. Vivash said no, definitely not. She wouldn't sell it because her 2 boys were at school in Perth, and she wanted to keep the station there for when the boys left school and came home. So this guy wouldn't accept that, the Bidgemeyer owner, so he set up this guy to go round there at night, in the middle of the night, and terrorise Mrs. Vivash. And this guy kept on doing that for quite some years, or for a couple of years, until Mrs. Vivash got so desperate about the whole thing, she rang the sergeant of police in Carnarvon. She said, look, I'm in dire straits here. This character's coming around once every couple of weeks and frightening the hell out of me, He's quite, intimidating and what have you. So finally the old sergeant, he said, well, how long since he's been there? And she said, about a week ago now. And the sergeant said, well, when do you reckon he'll be back again? He'll be back any time now, she said. He's coming more and more frequently. So the sergeant said, well, look, I'll tell you what. He said, I'll come out there. Can I come out and camp with you for 2 or 3 nights? And she said, look, I'd appreciate that. That'd be great. So out he comes and he camps there, and he'd been there I think it was his 2nd night he camped there. All of a sudden the Jimba Jimba ghost came around and started his terrifying tactics and making noises and shouting and carrying on, that sort of thing. So all of a sudden the sergeant got up, turned a light on, and there was the bloody Jimba Jimba ghost. But the Jimba Jimba ghost noticed him too, so he took off, turned around and took off. But unfortunately for him, the sergeant then had his shotgun there, and he let go with the shotgun. And that was the end of the Jimba Jimba ghost. They never saw him again. So probably 25 years later, the Jimba Jimba ghost was working for us at Lyndon. I didn't know that he was the Jimba Jimba ghost in those days. And his name was Jimmy Crow. And anyhow, Jim and I used to go bush straggler mustering, and also what was known as the high range on Lyndon. It's right out the back of Lyndon. It's a big high range area where sheep used to get out there, and the average mustering crew never got out there to pick them up. So Jim and I used to go out there and pick up these odd mobs and bring them back into the smaller paddocks towards the homestead. Anyhow, this particular night we pulled up at a water tank, and Jimmy said, I want to go and have a bundai. And a bundai, to those who don't know, means you want to have a wash. So he said to me, and I was only at this stage, I think I was probably 20 or something like that, and Jimmy said to me, you hobble the horses, boss, you hobble the horses, I go and have a bundai at the tank. So I hobbled the horses, and then I grabbed my towel and whatever, and I thought, I'll go and have a bundai as well. And I got to the tank, and Jimmy was still had all his gear off, and he saw me come, and he turned and he walked around the back of the tank, and that's when I noticed his back was all of his pockmarked back with shocking scars all over the back. And I said, Jimmy, what happened to you today? What happened? Oh, nothing. And he wouldn't tell me. I said, come on, Jim, what happened? No, nothing. So anyhow, later that night, we're sitting around the campfire, and we'd got into quite a bit of conversation, and we had a great relationship, old Jimmy and I. And I said, Jimmy, one thing you've got to do now, I'm not going to sleep if you don't tell me, but you've got to tell me what happened to your back. And he said, oh, well, all right, I'll tell you the story, but you've got to promise me you don't tell anybody. Well, and I didn't tell anybody until Jimmy had died some years later. But anyhow, the story was that he copped the shotgun in the back from the sergeant of police that night. And so that's how I got to know the Jimba Jimba ghost story, because he was the Jimba Jimba ghost.
Oh,
herself.
my goodness. I mean, it's not really my place to say, but Jimmy, I think that might be karma for you. That point, I'm just thinking how frightening it would be to be out there on your own.
Yeah.
You don't have, I wonder if back then she had access to a telephone or pedal radio or something.
No, wouldn't have had any of that.
On your own as a woman.
Yeah.
In the dark. You can't just flick on a light switch and, put floodlights on. She's very vulnerable.
No, absolutely.
If I were him, I would have said, yes, boss, I went and scared her, but I would have just gone for a walk and just not actually done the scary part.
Yeah.
Like, come on, Jimmy.
Yeah. Oh, no, well, of course, this guy, and I wouldn't mention his name because he's a well-known Victorian character who is related to a couple of the very historically well-known criminals in Melbourne in those days. I wouldn't mention his name, but he was dead set he wanted to buy Jimmy Jimba Station, and he wanted to convince them they could give it to him, basically, just by frightening the hell out of her. And so that's how it was all about. And he was pushing Jimmy to go and do the job for him.
I guess we're lucky that he only took it as far as sending a ghost over instead of just having her taken care of, I
exactly.
suppose.
And you don't know how far it might have gone if it had kept on going.
Mm.
That's the other thing, yeah.
My goodness. So after school, you spent some time jackarooing on the East Coast and working at home.
Yeah.
And then you had an opportunity to potentially go and play cricket overseas.
Yeah.
Tell me about that and what happened there.
Yeah, well, there was a team put together, a team of country West Australian players to go to England to play cricket in England, and also they played cricket in Germany, by the way, as well. So we happened to get selected as part of that group to go over there, and I was so excited about it, wanting to go across there. There was other people like Mike Meacham and, quite a number of people that still friends today that I see of that were part of that group. Anyhow, but then probably about 8 to 9 months before we were due to go, my dad became very ill. He was very ill and he had to spend a lot of time in Perth under a doctor and what have you. And the Munro family in England had relied on the Darcys since 1932, and they didn't have any options as to who was going to manage Lyndon. And so I got basically conned into the fact that I had to stay home and manage Lyndon. And so that's what happened, and I had to do that, and I couldn't go to England at that time and play cricket, which was one of the saddest things that happened to me later life.
So it was sort of the second time that your plans had been crushed. First of all, you had to leave school early.
Yeah.
And then you get this chance a few years later to go overseas and play cricket, and you had to say goodbye to that as well.
Yep. Yeah.
Were you resentful to come home?
Not really, because, you set yourself up in life that this is where you're going to go. And even back in those younger days, I had in my own mind then, I said, one day I'm going to try and buy my own place. But, I need to, even as a sort of, 17, 18-year-old, I had that in mind that one day I want to buy my own place. That was the industry. There was nothing else in the world that I wanted to do at that stage, and I didn't know of anything else that was worth pursuing.
At the point in time that you came back to manage Lyndon in your father's place, he'd been there for 32 years working for the same family who owned the property. Can you tell me a little bit about that family and what they were like to work with?
Well, they were an English family that lived in England, relied on the income the station made, because back through the 1950s, when the old story, when, wool was £1 a pound and that sort of thing, they lived off the bloody income off Lyndon. There were two daughters, two women that actually owned Lyndon, and their parents had been the original owners. They're part of the family. And then they married. One of them married Captain William Harkis, and the other one married, forget his name, but it was a Grant anyhow. So those the two women, Marjorie Harkis and whatever her name, Grant, were, and they lived in Perth. They'd married these other guys, and then their families had become part of it too. And And so, yeah, it was a family operation, Munro family. And then continued to live in Perth. And some of the younger brigade used to come to the station occasionally to have a holiday. And they were very nice people, very, very nice. But, they were very tight with their budgets and what have you. And they're quite happy to accept all the incomes, but they weren't too happy in paying out or doing anything. For instance, when I wanted to go start aerial mustering in 1964, and I was managing for them then, I was interested in perhaps securing an aircraft to start that, and I'd given them figures to show that I could cut their mustering costs quite substantially. Well, they wouldn't agree to that, so that's why I had to finally hire an aircraft and a pilot to go down that path, and the figures I was able to present at the time showed them how much more proficient we could get by doing what we're doing.
So it sounds like they were more interested in living off of the income than investing any back into the property itself.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they were living and the income. And I think probably what was happening too, from the early to mid 1950s, when they were making an absolute killing out of the place, with a woolet being a pound in those days and that sort of thing, and they were just living on the. But as we got into the 60s and that sort of thing, and later on, issues became a lot tighter. The cost of production was becoming a lot higher, and the income you're getting from wool was less. So they were getting tighter and tighter with anything that I want to spend on the stations to improve things.
That must have been incredibly frustrating for you, and at certain points for your father as well, when you can see things that need to be done around the station, and probably just general development as well of,
Yep.
What was, not that long ago, virgin country.
Yeah.
And you ask for some budget and they just won't give it to you.
No.
Meanwhile, they're down in Perth probably fine dining.
It got me I was quite angry over the time. I got to the point and I'd made up my mind that sooner or later I was going to either leave or go and look at other alternatives.
You did stick it out for quite a while working underneath them though, and you said, one of the changes that you brought in as you took over to manage was the use of aircraft.
Aircraft, yep.
I know it was...
I was able to convince them that they would save money by using the aircraft system.
So 1964 you started managing the station, and it was in that year as well that you hired the first aircraft to do aerial mustering.
Yeah.
When had you first become aware that aerial mustering even existed?
Well, it didn't exist predominantly, but I could see the values of it because I'd been in a plane with an upper guy, and I can't remember much about that, but I do remember flying around in a paddock one day and noticing that the sheep were running as I'd fly past and that sort of thing. And I thought at the time, I said, this got to be a new method of mustering sheep and getting, and finding sheep and that sort of thing. You're covering such a large area of country and that sort of thing, rather than some guy on a horse walking along in the middle of the paddock picking up a mob of 50 sheep, when all of a sudden over to his right about 200 metres another 200 sheep that he couldn't even see and that sort of thing. And this is why we're having the major straggler problem, that we're in stragglers with the sheep that were left over after you'd done your musters, because the mustering was becoming less and less efficient. So a lot of the old Aboriginal guys, the old original guys that could breed tracks much better than the younger guys and this sort of thing, it wasn't as efficient. They weren't as efficient. So
up until the point where you first introduced aircraft, how did mustering work?
Well, literally a team of musterers out into the paddock like I showed you, and riding you might have 6 or 7 riders on their horses, maybe 1 or 2 on motorbikes. We'd just started using the odd motorbike. Bikes weren't all that flash in those days, but still the odd one. I remember I used my first bike, I think, before I took over at Linden managing, I used my first bike and thought, it was quite good. And that's what convinced me of the factor that instead of having 5, 6 people on horseback running in a paddock, myself and maybe 2 others on bikes, with a plane in the air doing the spotting and giving us indications, we could probably save the mustering, save 4 or 5 different men.
What did your father and the Munro family think about the concept of using aircraft? Because it's vastly, vastly different than what they'd known for their entire lives.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, I spent a lot of painful hours trying to explain it to them, what I thought we could do. And like as I've just explained to you there, would cut back on our staff requirements and that sort of thing, doing it and whatever. And I had to convince them that they were going to save money. That was all they were interested in. And so that's down the path where they agreed that I could perhaps go ahead and do it. And while I had no option of being able to go and buy air, they wouldn't even consider buying an aircraft at that stage. That's why we hired aircraft over those succeeding years until I bought one. And it was only after that 4 years that they realised how much money I'd saved them going down the aerial mustering path that they finally agreed to let me buy an aircraft. They reckon it'd be cheaper than if they had their own aircraft with me flying it than having to lease an aircraft from someone else and pay another pilot doing it.
This first aircraft that you hired in 1964 came with a pilot by the name of Alan Rebus.
Yep.
This is, as you said, aerial mustering doesn't really exist at the time. So this isn't somebody with a mustering endorsement or a low-level endorsement or maybe perhaps even any stock sense.
No.
And you were there not as the pilot. You didn't have your license.
My passenger seat.
Yes. So was that quite a daunting experience that you've got somebody that, yes, they can fly a plane, but you're asking them to do something very different with that piece of equipment?
Well, this was the one good thing about Alan Rebus. Alan was a guy that he wasn't frightened of flying at low altitude. I mean, he didn't fly at really low altitudes, but he flied at a good, you know, he'd be a couple hundred feet above the ground sort of thing, and he wouldn't be doing any tight turns at the end of it coming round, because that's the danger area when you start doing tight turns to swing round and come back, and that's the stall area where people get killed and that sort of thing, and that's what happened to Frank Burt, unfortunately, with a trainee pilot. Those are the things that are part of the learning process until you could get to the night. That's when I realised that if I had my own aircraft, I could do so much more with my own aircraft and having better communication, because the communication system we used with that first aircraft was the old story of a bunch of paper bags, another bag full of small rocks, and a notepad, because we didn't have any air-to-ground radio in those days. So you'd fly over a bloke and you'd see a fellow as you flew over him. There's a mob of sheep about 200 or 300 yards over to his right, but obviously he couldn't see him. So you'd fly over him, and while the pilot went further down and turned back, I'd write a quick note and put it in the paper bag with a rock in with it and screw the top off. And I'd say to the pilot, go back over that same fellow there, will you, where there's got those sheep over on the right there. And I'd then drop the rock out to him, you see. And I'd told my blokes beforehand, I said, I'm going to drop messages to you fellas and that sort of thing. And so he'd go and find the bag. He'd see it come out. We got to the point that we're pretty proficient with it. We could drop it within sort of 10 or 20 sort of metres of them. Well, he never ever actually hit anybody. We were close to a couple of guys.
And very importantly, did you have good handwriting? Could they read what you were doing?
Oh, yeah, and you'd draw a bit of a map on a piece of paper. You'd draw a big circle, and there's the man on the horse riding that way, and then you'd take a line from there over to where those sheep over here, 300 metres across, and that sort of thing. And even the old Aboriginal guys would open it up and they'd look at that. They'd think, oh, yeah, he over that way somewhere. So away they'd go and they'd pick them up, and it worked.
It's funny because for anybody today, that would sound like such a slow and fiddly, fickle system to use. But at that point in time for you, like, that was the most efficient things had ever been.
Nothing else.
Yeah, like that would have been the
You didn't have
flashes.
such a thing as air-to-ground radio in those days.
But even compared to just having no aircraft at all, like this would have been so exciting and felt like you were mustering faster, you were getting cleaner musters. It would have just been the flashiest thing ever. Whereas today, this would be like the equivalent of driving a horse and cart.
That's right.
You mentioned that in those early days as well, particularly before, there was all these training protocols for aerial mustering itself as a new specialty, that there were a lot of accidents and fatalities.
Oh, yeah, there were.
A lot of people lost their lives
There were,
for us to get to the point where we are today.
Yeah. Well, what happened was DCA approached me and Frank Burt as we were the early musterers and that sort of thing. And Well, my first 4 years I was in somebody else's plane, but then I got to my plane, and by the time 71, 72, I had quite a few hours up. I had a couple of thousand hours up by then, because I used the plane to quite extensive degrees. And anyhow, they approached us to know if we would be prepared, because we were the first in the business sort of thing, to teach young guys who were wanting to learn to fly and come back and learn to be aerial musterers and that sort of thing, to teach these young guys all the tricks, and the dangers of it all, and how you overcame a lot of that sort of stuff. And I must admit, at the time, I sort of thought my attitude was, I don't know that I really want to get involved with other people and that sort of thing. I've got enough problems in my world at the moment, sort of thing. Frank agreed, yes, he would do it. He was quite happy to do that. The odd bloke, he wasn't going to do big numbers. Unfortunately, and we can only assume this how it happened, Frank took a young guy up with him, first guy I think, and started giving him some training, and anyhow they both went in and killed themselves, both of them. And my version of it, because I'm aerial muster and that sort of thing, because I know the game, I mean, you're in an aircraft with controls, lots of controls. Your right-hand control, left hand. Well, your left hand is your trainee, your right hand is your trainer. And I can only assume that, being in the game at that early stage and knowing Frank as I knew him and that sort of thing, and he was pretty efficient sort of a guy, that the trainee, they're probably doing their light thing, and maybe Frank was doing a bit and getting him at very low level and learning him to turn sharply at low level and that sort of thing. And that's the stage when you stall your aircraft and you go. I'm suspecting that, and my interpretation of is that Frank probably got into low level turn and they got into the stall position where he would normally correct it quickly himself. The young bloke locked onto the controls and Frank couldn't get control of the aircraft. And that's, I think, what probably happened. And they went in because the young bloke probably petrified and started to lose control, just locked onto the controls, and Frank couldn't correct it. So that's, I presume, that's what happened there, and that was just my interpretation of it. So that convinced me never to go ahead and training some other young guys to do aircraft. And I think one of the things I did say to DCA at that side, after that, I made a point that if somebody was going to teach kids to do that, they have to teach it at altitude, not at 50 or 100 feet above the ground. They'd teach them at an altitude that what it was to get into a stall and have to correct a stall within sort of 100 feet above the ground and all that type of thing. And, yeah, I think that's something I learned at a very early age and survived it all.
It's definitely a very sad story. And, like you said, I mean, someone had to teach people, everyone right. Couldn't go on just kind of teaching themselves forever. But unfortunately, this is what happens in those situations. So that was in the early 70s. You got your license in 68, which you must have been very keen for after spending 4 years as a passenger spotting. Yep. You must have, by the time you got into the control seat, you must have been well and truly ready for it. Oh, yeah. I can't imagine you sitting there patiently for 4 years.
I knew pretty well how to fly at that stage too, because, I had controls in the Chipmunk as well. I was quite often doing a lot of the flying myself, and with Alan, showing me what needed to be done and what have you. So,
when did radios come into effect to be actually of use? Because I've heard some stories that in some of the early aircraft with radios, you could pick up channels of people out at sea or somewhere else, and it could be quite, or it would just be quite distorted anyway. It didn't really help you with the radio, the different handhelds that were on the ground. The different
channels and whatever, Oh, look, I think that pretty was when I first started to fly myself. There was a radio system that you could use. They were big multi things, but they did work okay. But it happened pretty quickly. Then you got the local little time radios. By about 70, they were prolific. You had plenty of them. So it changed your whole concept of aerial mustering and that sort of thing.
So you weren't having to fly, draw a map and throw it out all by yourself. By the time you started, you kind of got to use a radio.
Oh, yeah, no, it was starting to use the radio by then, yep, well and truly, yeah.
And how popular was flying? Because I understand like quite a few people in the region or across the state ended up getting their licence and planes.
Yeah, they did. A lot of people went into planes, but flying aircraft can be pretty expensive. You know, you're burning a lot of fuel and all this sort of thing, and maintenance and all that type of thing. So when you get into the aerial mustering thing, you've got to make sure you're actually earning money as you do it. You're mustering cattle, mustering sheep, whatever it is, and you don't do extra hours, but what you do is save it by you saving staff on the ground. And we'd cut our staff usage, by quite substantial numbers. For instance, after I'd bought Lyndon and I went to Udamilla, for what it's worth, I used to have to manage this new place that I had on one air boundary to the other when we were mustering cattle. It was 85 k's. So we'd start mustering at one end, and by sundown we were halfway home with the cattle, but we had no yards or anything, and just open country. So you had to keep moving the cattle all night for 24 hours. You're driving, mustering and driving cattle for 24 hours. So I'd be flying all day, putting the cattle together for the team, and then in the evening when it started to get sundown, I have to go and land and jump in a Land Rover and come back out and give them a hand for the rest of the night, sort of thing. So they were long days.
I understand that at this time it was also getting harder to get handy staff because they were heading off to another industry.
Yeah, to the mining industry, yeah. The mining industry, when they really first started getting in big time, the most valuable staff they could get were people that had worked in the bush and worked on stations, because they were efficient. They knew how to live in ordinary circumstances. They knew how to live and look after themselves and how to travel through into the bush without getting lost and that sort of thing. Whereas you get young folks that come out of the city in those days, they try and take them out in the bush and that sort of thing. Next thing you know, they're bloody lost somewhere in the bush. They wouldn't know how to sort of cope with living a normal life, sort of thing. And that had to be changed. The mining industry eventually changed that today, and that's why you have all these regulations that you live in these days if you're employed at the mining industry. But also the other factor was they paid a lot more money than we could afford to pay to attract these people.
So it's not just a problem that's been happening for the last 10, 20 years. This has been going on since the 60s.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, yep.
One of the biggest, and I would say most possibly the most important thing that happened to you in the 1960s was that you met your future wife, Chris. How did that come about?
Well, my friend Ross Finlayson and I had just completed our trip across Australia in a single-engine aircraft. We arrived back in Perth and effectively handed the aircraft back to its owners, and then within a day or so I jumped in the car and drove back to Carnarvon. And when I arrived in Carnarvon, I think I arrived there one afternoon, about 2:00 in the afternoon, and the Carnarvon races were on. That's where I ran into her, at the races. The only problem was I got there and I'd met a few of my mates as well, and we drank quite a lot of beer and alcohol and what have you, and then I required this nurse to drive me home back to town that night.
That sounds like a ploy if I've ever heard one. Chris, had you ever come across Tim before that afternoon at the races?
No, I'd heard of him, but I hadn't met him before. And one of the guys I was nursing in Carnarvon came from another station and introduced us at the races.
And was Tim fairly sober at that point in time? I know he needed...
Absolutely not. He needed to live back to the Port Hotel where he was staying.
So it wasn't really the best first impression that he's given you?
No.
Oh, Tim. And what were you doing in Carnarvon at the time?
Nursing at the hospital.
And were you from Carnarvon?
No, Northam, another country town.
Okay, so you were still a country girl. You were
Yep.
kind of used to the outback. When do you, after this, you provide a lift and you say good luck to you for the rest of your night, how does that then evolve into a year later marriage?
Well, he actually asked me if I'd like to go to the ball at the Port Hotel with him that night, which I did, and met all these other people from the stations, which was fun. And then the next week he flew into town to ask me out to dinner. But Carnarvon's pretty small and there's not too many places to go to dinner.
Did it feel quite special back then that, instead of picking up the phone, he flew into town to ask you out? Was that quite fancy?
Yeah, I suppose it was a bit fancy at the time.
And how long was it before you got to go out to Lyndon and see what a cattle station or what a sheep station at that time was like?
A few weeks. I went out with a girlfriend, drove my car out and spent the weekend out there just on our days off. So it was pretty strange, and I got lost a few times. It's quite a big homestead. I look at it now and I think, how could I possibly? But I did.
What were your first impressions of, Northam is rural, but it's nowhere near as remote as the Gascoyne and the Pilbara. What were your impressions going out to Lyndon? And did you think, could I live out here, or were you, did you feel
I was just thinking of going for a nice horse ride for the weekend. I wasn't thinking I might be living out there.
So he just wooed you in with the horses?
Yeah, he did.
And so when you live in, how far away is Carnarvon from Lyndon?
300.
300. And back then that would have been dirt roads?
Yep, with lots of gates.
Yeah. That's not a way to get a girl in, Tim. So that would have been well over a 3-hour drive then with all the gates and probably more than that.
No, 3 hours about.
With the gates, it was probably a bit more than that, actually.
Yeah.
But 3.5 at least.
So when you're that far apart, and you would have been quite busy on the station, Tim, and you would have been busy in town nursing, how do you keep in touch and date when you're so far apart?
Well, we met in October and we were engaged by Christmas. So, and then I came down to Perth, and Tim came down just before our wedding, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he made quite an impression on you.
We used to go to back in those days, we used to play polocrosse, and we went to a couple of those functions together too. There's a photo of Chris somewhere, I think, in her Morris Major, that driving back from one of those polocrosse functions, wasn't it?
No, that was when I went off the road.
So
you must have been quite a smooth operator though, Tim, to close the deal in a couple of months. I mean, you did your license in 3 weeks. I didn't know if anything could be done quite faster, but you almost beat that record with an engagement.
Yeah, we got engaged at Christmas.
Yeah, we did. That's right. And that was the frightening period, because then I had to front up to her mum and dad.
You don't know me, but I'd like to take your daughter out to the middle of nowhere. Essentially.
Something like that.
And so when you first, I assume, did you not move out to Lyndon until after the wedding?
No, I didn't. I was in Perth.
How was it moving out to Lyndon? That would be a big change for you.
Well, the cook had left while we were on our honeymoon. So when we got out there was quite a big staff, and I had 3 recipes that I did very well. Chicken Maryland, and I had to kill a chook to do that. And I could cook a steak, and I could boil an egg. So it was very daunting, actually, because I had to take over the kitchen and cooking and doing everything, really.
And did you have to give up your job as a nurse as well?
Yep.
Officially? How did that feel? Was that something?
That was a bit sad.
But you were kept quite busy with, so
I was really busy.
So you had to step into the role of cook as well.
Yep.
And that sounds like it must have been quite a learning curve, having to learn to kill a chicken.
It was. Well, it was all a big learning curve.
How was it adjusting to the station compared to life in town?
Oh, if we were married in March, and it was very, very hot. The first time I opened the first kerosene fridge to check what was in it, all this green slime ran out because it had actually gone off and the meat was all off, and that stank. So the kerosene fridges took a bit of getting used to keep them trimmed so they burnt properly, and the boiler for the hot water, we had one 44-gallon drum, which is called a donkey, which other people have probably mentioned, but we just had the donkey hot water system. And, you know, to keep the beer cold for all the men, that was a bit hard too, in a kerosene fridge. And then if, you know, every now and again I'd forget to put it all in because they were allowed to have one long, what do you call them? Long John thing or...
Oh, yeah, King Brown.
A King Brown. They're allowed to have one King Brown a night. So, yeah, that was hard.
Few nights where they had warm beers.
Yes, of course they did.
And of course, you had staff out on the station, but other than that, did you find it lonely going from, you know, being in a big town or a relatively big town with lots of people, and now you've just got a very small group of people that you cohabitate with?
Yeah. Yes, it was. It was lonely because...
You were the young one.
Yeah, I was a lot younger than the other women in the district. And it was lonely for a start, but you certainly, you know, you get busy and that's okay.
A couple of years after moving out to Lyndon, when you guys were married, the two of you had an opportunity to buy Lyndon from the owners. Tell me about that point in time and how that came about.
We didn't have an opportunity, actually. What we did was that we'd just about had enough of being used, so we made them an offer through our accountant. And I can remember the first meeting we were at, the attitude was, how dare the young upstarts, good God, how can they possibly take that attitude and that sort of thing? And I said, well, I'm terribly sorry, I know that's a bit of a problem for you, but we will give you... would we give 6 weeks' notice or 8 weeks? Was it? I can't remember, but 6 weeks' notice so that you would need to find another manager. And because we were going to go out and start looking at other alternatives for ourselves. We did have another guy who'd sort of offered me some sort of a deal with, even an American guy offered a bit of a deal for maybe getting into some sort of a partnership arrangement. And anyhow, so that was it. So that was the answer we got initially until about 3 days later, and the accountant, a fellow called Roy Long, rang up and he said, you want a bit of good news? And we said, what's that? And he said, you've got the deal.
Tell me about that deal and how it came together.
Well, the thing was that these partners that we had, one of them was the manager of CIL, which is Compagnie d'Importation de Laine, is a French bull buying company. And they had already bought a station in the Leonora area and had a guy managing there for them, but they weren't very impressed with that. And they were serious wool people. There was the owner, the guy who did the management of this team, and then his sub-manager as well, the two of them. And so we got into negotiation, Chris and I with them, and they decided they wanted to buy into it, and we were the people. They were pretty convinced that we were going to be pretty good management operators for it. So we made an offer on the basis of the value of the wool clip on the sheep's back, estimated value of the sheep on the wool's back. And these people, because they were wool buyers, they could give us a price on it. So that was the price we offered. It was in the period when wool prices were pretty low and everything else, and one thing led to another, so we offered them that price.
So was it just off the price of the wool on their back, or did you have like plant and equipment and anything else, the value of the land, or was it just the wool?
Just the wool on the sheep's back. And then we had to muster the sheep, get them in and finally get them shorn and get the wool down to Perth. Then our next concern was the operating costs of the whole operation until the next wool clip next year. So we had to borrow money from a bank at that stage to do all that. But then the repayment, because we didn't have security of that money, we had to make sure we used other methods to that cost, and that was doing deals, and one of the deals was the 5,000 wethers from Meyermeyer.
So tell me about this deal with Maya. What did that look like?
Well, we just made them an offer for their 5,000 wethers, and they had these sheep for sale because they were in trouble financially, as seasonal wise, and where they were at the shed, they were about 20 k's west of Lyndon's western property, a western area. So we had to go in and walk those with a team of people. Go over there and take delivery of those 5,000 wethers and then walk them back through to Lyndon. And in that period, during that period as well, because we had the bank loan, we'd actually sell some of our own wethers, which were fat, and they were bringing pretty good money. So we bought these 5,000 wethers that we bought across. They were much cheaper, and so they were then could be our ongoing return as they fattened in the season with the season.
So when you bought Lyndon in a partnership, so you had to then take out a bank loan to cover operating costs.
Yep.
In the meantime. To service that loan, you needed an income. So then you borrowed more money to buy some wethers, which the idea was to bring them back to Lyndon, fatten them up and sell them to service the loan.
Yeah.
There's a lot of balls in the air there. There's, you've got a new partnership with a new business partner. You've got the loan for the operating costs, and then you've increased that loan to buy these. Did you get stressed at all that you've got a lot of things going on and there's a lot riding on this?
There was stress all the way through, wasn't there, Dale? I mean, we're under pressure, acute pressure, the whole thing. But I've always worked on the situation then. If you're ever going to do anything in life to secure your future, you do it before you're 40 or 45 because you can take punts. And we took a big punt. I mean, while we did buy the Maya wethers and we brought them across, we already sold some fat Lyndon wethers, which paid the bill partly for those Maya wethers, and kept the stock companies who you're doing a lot of your deals through, kept them sort of happy as well. Because the more dealing they could do, the more happy they were. And the individuals that were arranging the deals for you with them, that was part of their business, making their living with the companies. And
so it sounds like you had a fairly healthy risk appetite. And would you put that down to your age at the time, that the younger you are, the bigger risk you can take?
When you've got nothing,
I don't know. You got a lot of debt. I wouldn't call that nothing.
Yeah, well, that's the only way you get through into the life. And if you go and talk to some of the big people in the world, the Solomon Lews and people like that, they all started off with massive debts.
Mm-hmm. And what about, once you've taken on this debt, I'm assuming things started to be a little bit lean for a while?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Tell me about those days. Those early days, I suppose.
Well, you used the stock firms, you used the banks, you manipulated the finances best you could with those groups. You looked to any way you could make money, and most of it was finished up with deals that we did by trading and a couple of the stock companies, they knew the situation we were in. So I've got to say, a couple of those manager guys who I was quite friendly with, they would ring us and say, oh, there's a deal going here, you can do this and do that and probably make some money there and that sort of thing. And I give some of those guys a lot of credit for what we did too.
So was the basis of most of your deals being able to take stock that other people needed to offload? You had the space or the feed for them, allow them to gain weight, grow wool, do whatever they needed to do, and then you offload them at a profit.
Yeah. Yeah, you used all the factors were your seasonal conditions, the price situation, your probably belief in where the market was going over the next 12 or 18 months, and you could think, well, okay, if I can buy those at $20 now, I can probably sell them for about $60 in 12 months' time. So it was part of keeping in touch with, well, I suppose, world events and everything that was going on, because if your markets got affected by everything like that, and you could see opportunities yourself and where you'd take advantage of some of that, what may be going to happen. And most of the time it did work for us. And so we were fortunate in that we talked to the right people, kept communicating with the right people. And there were some very good people in the stock industry then.
John Faithful, John Hogue.
John Hogue, Johnny Faithful, people like that were very helpful to us too.
Now, it's one thing to increase your debt to buy stock that you're going to trade, but only a couple of years after having Lyndon, when, as we've said, these are lean times where you're trying to service this debt and increase your equity in the property, you bought another station.
Yep.
Tell me about that and also where the confidence to do that came from.
Good point, actually. But Udamalla Station was for sale. One of the things was it was very cheap because it was very light on with the amount of stock on it. And there were more stocks than the people that owned it realised at the time. And because I could fly an aircraft and have a bit of a look around, there were a lot of cattle on there, sort of wild cattle, that they didn't know they even had there. And we knew that we could seize it. But also it was at the stage when I was starting to realise that some of the deals that we could do, such as the Maya deal, the Anna Plains deal, were deals you could do to make trading, to make money. And if you could tie those together to purchase properties, particularly a place like Udamalla, I think of that 1,000 cattle we bought from Anna Plains, I think 400 stayed at Lyndon, 600 went to Udamalla.
So your idea was that trading was going to be a big part of being able to service your debt, but
absolutely.
To take advantage, to be able to trade, to make it advantageous, you needed more land to do that.
Yeah, that was absolutely it. It was the trading factor. It was the only way you could doing it was by trading and using some of the very good stock broking people to do that. And there were some very bright people in amongst that. They were friends and got on for years and that sort of thing, continued to be friends and that sort of thing because they did the deals with us. They helped us do the deals.
Where is Udamalla relative to Lyndon, location-wise?
It's southeast of us by road about 70 k's, probably southeast of us about 120 k's.
So you don't...
By road.
Do you share a boundary?
No.
So
by air, it was about 35 minutes flight.
Was location important for you when you were looking at options of purchasing or acquiring more land where it was relative to Lyndon?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, it's a property that's been a very good property over a lot of years and never been highly managed because it's got a lot of good river country on it. And when you've got stations that are good river country, that's where your feed grows when the moment it rains. And Udamalla's got some very good river country on it.
You mentioned a deal with Anna Plains. Tell me about that.
Well, John Hogue, who was stock manager of West Farmers in Carnarvon, he rang me and he said, we actually had a good rain and we had a lot of feed around and that sort of thing. He said, are you interested in doing a deal with some cattle? And I said, oh, yeah, it could be, John, but sort of what sort of price are you talking? He said, look, I don't know, but he said it's very low price because they're in trouble season-wise. And I think they'd be prepared to sell fairly cheaply. And it was owned by the American guy.
Linkletter.
And a friend of mine that I knew of, Alan Lane, who was managing it for them. So I said, yeah, we could go and have a look, John, and see what it's like. So I rang, he said, you come out here and we'll jump in my plane and we'll fly up there. On the way, we flew and we flew to Yanry and we bought picked up Tom Olson, who was also interested in buying cattle from up there as well, because they had about 3,000 cattle for sale. When we got to Anna Plains, I flew around for quite a while before I landed there. I'd want to check the country out and see how much feed there was on it and what the situation looked like and that sort of thing. And it was obvious to me it was a very desperate situation because the season was shocking and cattle weren't very good in condition, and if they didn't start selling cattle, they were going to lose cattle seasonally wise. So when we landed, Alan met us Alan Bain met us and he said, "Oh, you fellas come to buy cattle?" And I said, "Oh, not really, Alan." I said, "Maybe if we could get them at the right price, but I said, we're not really in a position to be able to afford to pay much." So he said, "So what price are you prepared to offer?" And I said, "Oh, Alan, I'm only thinking $15 a head, 18-month-old bullock." Anyhow, he said, "Oh, God, that's getting a bit rich." He said, "That's sort of a bit rude and that sort of thing." I said, "Look, fair enough, Alan, but look, we'll cool up and have a cup of tea with you and have a bit of a yarn anyhow." But I said, "I really can't afford very much." Anyhow, as we started getting off the plane and getting down and getting into the car, I said, "Tell you what, Alan, I'll make it $17. And thinking that's going to be a bit rude too. And after about a bit of thinking for a while, he said, "Okay, you got a deal." And so that's what we did. And Tom Olsen then followed in. He said, "Oh, well, look, I'll buy 500 for $17 too." So he bought another 500 as well.
Wow. So $1,700 a head for 1,000 bullocks.
Yeah.
Cheapest cattle purchase in history.
So those cattle we would have made probably average somewhere between, I don't know, around about $600, I guess, when we in sale in due course. So that was a fairly significant amount of money, profits and all of that.
And you, I think you mentioned earlier that having Udamalla was important then because you spread those cattle out between Lyndon and Udamalla.
Yeah. And that was part of the deal, yeah. Yeah. So, yeah.
And after this point in time, you seem to be on a bit of a roll because, another year or two later, you buy a third station and then a fourth. Yeah. Within a period of, I think it was 6 or 7 years, you acquired four stations.
Yeah.
Tell me about Towra and Maroona.
Well, Towra, the Stroud family owned it. They didn't have a manager there and they were battling because they also had Winning, their own station, and then they'd bought Kadari as well. And they were battling management-wise. They just couldn't find the people to manage their properties and what have you. And they were in a fair bit of trouble. And Towra, at that stage, they'd burnt the shearing shed down the year before. And so, therefore, they had nowhere to shear all their sheep. And they had 25,000 sheep on Towra. And so he was in a fair bit of trouble there. And I could see that, and they were sort of didn't know what the hell they were going to do because where were they going to shear? They had 25,000 sheep there. Where were going to shear the sheep? So that was a good opportunity for me then to go to them and say, make them an offer for Towra, because I knew that we lived at Lyndon next door, even though we were shifting sheep 60 and 70 k's, we knew we could bring them down and shear the sheep. Anyhow, I made them an offer on the price that I offered based on that and that presumption, that sort of thing. And I think they just sort of thought, yeah, well, God, let's get rid of it because, it's got to be a nightmare. Otherwise, how are we going to shear our sheep and whatever and all that sort of thing. So then we had to go ahead and muster all those sheep on Towra, 25,000 plus our 35,000 at Lyndon, bring them all the way down, muster the whole of Towra, walk them all the way down to Lyndon, paddock them on the way down and whatever, then eventually muster Lyndon as well and that sort of thing. And so at that year at Lyndon, we shore 80,000 sheep or something.
So you effectively doubled your wool clip in 1 year and your workload.
Oh, in fact, absolutely.
Massively. What does that just mean that you are out for twice as much that year? And do you have to get extra crew, extra everything?
We had a big crew.
We had a big crew. We had some very good young people. Yeah, we just did it. We just worked. I mean, I was never out of the plane. Chris had to bring 2 kids up effectively on her own because I was always away. If I wasn't on the plane all day, I wasn't doing something. And
you were trucking.
I was trucking. I was driving trucks as well. We had our big trucking systems working. I was going back and forwards to Perth on the truck. 48-hour round trip to Perth. Bugger all sleep.
Chris, what were these times like for you? I mean, Tim just said you effectively were a single parent.
My life looked like shifting my office work to the dining room where I could put the kids in a playpen and watch them at the same time because I was doing all the office work for the stations then. And there was usually someone at home. I wasn't always by myself. We had a yardman who was there And he'd light the boilers and rake up the yard and chop the wood and stuff like that. So I had company. But yeah, no, it was busy. It was seriously a very busy period of time. And then when we were working at Tara, we didn't have a cook. So I can remember some days getting up really early, putting the kids in the car, preparing all the lunches, making an evening meal. And I'd drive it all up there, stick it in the fridge, help in the yards for a couple of hours, pick the kids up again and drive back. But it wasn't a long drive. It's an hour to Tara. Or was more.
A bit less than that.
Yeah. Well, it is now, but the road was pretty awful then.
Yeah.
Before they put that highway through.
Yeah.
Very busy times.
Yeah.
I can imagine that when you just had Lyndon, you think, okay, this is what we've got and this is what we need to work towards paying off. But in such a short period of time, you've got an extra 2 or then 3 stations, so 4 total. Did you see, I guess, light at the end of the tunnel? Like, did you know when these really busy times might slow down?
No. And it took us a lot of years to get even. A lot of years.
And there was early period too, almost, when the pipeline was being built down through our stations down south. And so we were dealing with the pipeline industry as well. And at one stage how many did we have camped at Lyndon? And
I started doing catering contracts. And at one point I had 50 men living just outside our fence near the chook yard. They set up a big camp there with 50 rooms and then 2 great big washrooms, basins, laundry and what have you. And we redesigned just our main kitchen area at the homestead and they'd all eat. I fed and watered and cleaned and looked after 50 blokes for 6 months.
Chris got paid for that. That was part of the school.
I would most certainly hope so.
Yeah, that helped put the kids through school.
Was it a case of when this offer comes to you, can you do this? Do you even get time to think, do I want to do this? Do I have time to do this? Or is it, we need the money, I'm just going to do this?
No, it was like we seriously needed more income because we had the kids about to go to school.
Yeah.
So that's when we started that.
And we had extra
85.
staff too. We had some extra staff. We had a niece of mine there at one stage too. She was doing part of the cooking.
Has she helped me?
Yeah, she helped. But that was a memorable occasion because all the staff, the mining staff and the pipeline staff, a lot of them were very English. And they were back in the days when the union movement in England was very strong. So one day they all decided they weren't happy with the mining company, with the pipeline company, so they'd go on strike.
Just sat around our swimming pool.
All
these blokes.
And Chris and our niece, who was then doing some cooking for us, she went to the swimming pool one day and these guys were all sitting around the swimming pool and they said, "Oh, g'day, girlie, how are you?" And she said, "Yes, I'm very well, thanks." She was going to jump in the pool too. And they said, "Well, hang on, I thought you were getting lunch for us." And she said, "No, I'm on strike. I'm not getting lunch for you." 50-odd guys. You're not getting a meal. So they were on strike. So for the mining company were pretty grateful because we broke the strike for them.
How was that for you, Chris? Sometimes at periods of time it was just you and the kids and maybe 1 or 2 staff around the homestead, and then all of a sudden you've got 50 strange men in your space.
Well, that was in 85 and the kids had gone to school in 83. So they weren't home.
Yeah.
Which was good. And the minute they left to go to school, I started studying workers' compensation and bookkeeping and stuff just to improve my skills, and did a course with H&R Block so I could do the tax returns for all the people on the station. So I was doing that for a while as well, but it wasn't the first contract I had, that big one of 50. I started off when there was a small surveying company before they even built the infrastructure for the pipeline. We're very near a compressor station, which has just got all these great big, huge aircraft engines, and they compress all the gas and then push it on further down the line. So when they were first surveying that's when I started the catering, because one of the blokes at the camp, they had about 12, 15 men, wanted to go for leave, and he came up to the homestead one day and he said, could I look after his blokes? I said, yeah, sure, piece of cake. But they had to be at work. They had to have breakfast by 5:30, so I had to leave home at 3:30. And that was good. That, you know, you learn as you go. And he gave me lots of good tips of how to do shortcuts and stuff when you're catering for a lot of people. So that was good. But also I got a contract when they first built the compressor station. They had a lot of staff coming and going. And I think they had about 12 rooms in a sort of 2 houses with bathrooms, etc. And I took the contract of cleaning those as well. So I was down there once a week, sort of, you know, just doing the cleaning and checking everything. Yeah.
So it sounds like you always had something going on.
Oh, yeah.
Did you ever go out with the livestock? Did you enjoy that side of things?
Yep. I was down the yards most of the time during shearing. I had 2 little daxies, and my job, if I wasn't helping with drafting and stuff, was being there after each run to backline. And one year with 2 little daxies and 2 races, I put 40,000 sheep through by myself with these 2 tiny little dogs.
Daxies were the best things. They got sheep moving. They'd go under their legs, listen to their sheep and join in the races.
Yeah.
Kelpies eat your heart out. Now, before you came out to the station, I know, as we said, you're from Northern, which is a rural country town. Had you had any experience with livestock?
Not really. I learnt to ride helping the abattoirs bring their sheep and cattle in on the weekends, ready for the week's kill. But no, other than that, I lived in town. My father was a chemist.
So it's safe to assume that Tim would have had to show you the ropes and teach you. I was just wondering what he was like as a teacher. If he was patient with you or perhaps otherwise.
Not very patient.
We didn't have a lot of spare time.
No, we didn't have spare time. You didn't have time for novices in the yards.
In the early 1980s, you sold Udamalla Station.
Yep.
Why did you do that?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. It was a remote station, a remote area, so we couldn't use our communal staff, local communal staff that looked after Maroona, Linden, Tower and Maroona. We couldn't use them at Udamalla, so we had to have a separate staff location over there, separate management structure. When we ever want to do anything, I had to fly across there on a regular basis and that sort of thing. So that was one of the reasons. And also financially, I think it was starting to become a burden to us, being able to keep control of Udamalla with a totally separate management, totally a separate staff structure and everything like that was, starting to not look very profitable. So I think we came to the conclusion that we should sell it. Also, we had the pressure of the Million Acre pressure as well, which was coming on. We didn't sell it. We gave it away, effectively. And,
Were you sad to see it go?
Yeah, I was actually, because I'd done a lot of work over there, huge amount of work.
When you spend so much time growing, and you grew so much as a business in the 70s, then to downsize, does that feel like going backwards, or is that more of a mindset that you've got to wrap your head around?
No, because then I'd got this mindset that we weren't going to, by just keeping and growing in the pastoral regions, there wasn't going to be a big operation. Your best operation is to breed in the pastoral regions and fatten in the south, because you've got assured markets, whatever you do. Assured markets covers your seasons, covers a whole heap of things. And, we send 3,000 cattle a year off Linden and Tara to Perth, down to the farms down here, and sometimes more. That's where you make your money.
So it sounds like you are starting to rethink your strategy. So rather than just growing big for the sake of being big, you're starting to be a bit more strategic.
Yeah.
What was the million acre problem that you just mentioned before?
Well, in those days, there was a specified limit that you couldn't own more than 1 million acres. We didn't take much notice of it. We thought at the time, I did think about it, and at the time I thought, well, maybe we should be just buying on different company names and that sort of thing. And I thought, then that becomes a problem bookkeeping-wise and all sorts of things and dealing with governments and whatever. So we went ahead with it, and then this guy came to us and threatened us that unless he could become a partner, he would apply the regulation or the law to us. I refused to do the deal with him because I didn't think he was a very nice character, and I'd known him before that, and I thought that's the last thing you want is to be in partnership with someone like that.
So you hoped that in the future that situation would change, but you knew it wasn't going to change anytime soon. So, and as you said, it's a tricky situation when it's sort of a rule, but not one that had ever really been enforced. So, so you made the decision to let Unimalla go. There was, speaking of partnerships though, there was going to be some changes coming up in the next few years with the partnership that you had for the business that you owned. So while this person who wanted to come in on it didn't, what about your existing partners? What changed there?
One partner died and his business who effectively bought his family out. The other partner and ourselves bought his family out. Basically, it was just minor, really minimal type sort of considerations, but still we did that. And then my main partner, he was starting to indicate that he wanted to sell out, and that's when the Tom family came in and offered to buy him out because we couldn't afford to buy him out at that stage. We just didn't have the money and the capacity to be able to do it. And then we were in partnership with the Toms for, 18 months?
I don't know, a couple of years.
2 years. Yeah.
And then you were able to buy them out?
And then we were able to buy them out, yep. They wanted to get out and, so we were able to buy them out. And,
so by the mid to late 80s, you guys were the sole owners of Linden, Towra and Marina.
Yep. Yeah.
It's a long way from where you started out as the managers of Linden.
Oh, yeah. No, it was, yeah.
How did that feel when I don't know how it came about, the opportunity to buy out the Tom family, but once that sort of was signed, sealed and delivered, how did that feel when you had no one to answer to but yourself and I guess the banks, but really just you?
I guess it's sort of something that's never really occurred to me in any great form whatsoever because we're always looking at what our next situation was, and basically that was start buying properties down here.
So during the previous 15 odd years that you had business partners, it wasn't a weight on you that you're like, we just want to do this on our own. We don't want to have to answer to anyone.
We always got on very well with our partners. We had always had good relationships with our partners. And that was never a problem, was it, Dale, at any stage? No. We always got on very well together. The Tom family, we got on extremely well. We still get on very well together as friends and that sort of thing now. So
now that you guys are fully in control, one of the first things you did was sell Marina and buy property, a farm down south on freehold land. Yep. Tell me about the thought process behind that.
Well, it was the start of our whole process of changing our whole thinking pattern from breeding in the north and fattening and selling down south. And that was basically the whole process of that.
In the early 1990s, you decided to get out of wool and convert completely to cattle production because through your involvement in agri-politics, you had seen what was happening with the wool stockpile and you weren't very hopeful about the future of the wool industry in Australia. How hard of a decision was that for you? Not only is this your entire business model, but also your family's legacy.
Well, it's doing your genetics all the time, you know. Every ram that went through, you're examining their wool and working out what you'll keep and what you'll sell. And it's a lot of work to build up your genetics to that point that you're getting your wool just where you want it. And also, too, it's what we were used to doing. We weren't used to handling cattle.
But the other thing was, the big thing there was that you could see, if you were half clever, you could see the wool industry was in total decline and continuing to decline. And when you're in an industry that's going to continue to fail, you've got to be the first person out, not the last person out or the middle person out. You've got to be the first person out. So that's what helped us make this decision when we came. And the night we landed at Linden, when we got back, we sat the four of us around the table and said, I think we've got to get out of the wool industry. We've got to be the first people to get out because you could still get money for your sheep when you sold.
So, I mean, the writing, I guess it's one, I mean, it's hard. I've only got hindsight here to say that the writing was on the wall. On the other hand, you didn't have a crystal ball. I mean, there could have been a miracle. It could have
all here.
Yeah. There could have been a miracle or something at the 11th hour to save it. And at this point in time, you're probably, I'd say, in your early 50s from the math I'm doing in my head. Earlier, you said, you know, if you're going to take a risk, do it before you're 40. Yeah. And now you're in your 50s and you're looking at changing your entire business model, which as Chris said, you know, that's all the genetics that you've had for 60 odd years that you've been working towards, all your infrastructure, what you know. So it's a big change. It's a big call to make. And like you said, to be the first out.
It takes courage, I tell you what. Yeah. It takes a lot of courage to make a decision like that. I'm sure you that. There was no doubt about that. But
once you made it,
you could see, I mean, just technically, if you had half a brain, you could see that the industry was in continuing decline and there was no real, because synthetics had taken control. And therefore, wool was never going to be back to anything like its levels where it's a totally required product.
Once you made that decision and started the ball rolling to get out of wool, did you ever do a double take and think, have I made the right decision?
Look, when you've made a decision, you've got to stick by your decision. You don't make decisions and start thinking back, oh, geez, I shouldn't have done that and I shouldn't have done that. You've made a decision, so you work with it. And you've got to go with that all the way.
Tell me about the process of getting out of sheep and converting to just full-time cattle production.
Oh, well, it wasn't difficult actually because, I mean, you just use your agents. I mean, we would sell sheep wherever there was a market. We could sell sheep and people want to buy sheep, and it became well known that we had, I don't know, 50, 60,000 sheep and we were selling our sheep and what have you, and anybody that wanted to make an offer, they could buy sheep from us and that sort of thing. And everybody knew that we had good quality sheep and what have you. And it's like us buying cattle. We were trying to buy cattle in the best deals we could do at the time. And we're in the process of selling sheep, buying cattle, selling sheep, buying cattle, and through that period. And it took us a while and we didn't get settled down to that until about 94, 95.
It took us about 5 years.
5 years, yeah.
How do you go about dispersing your mob of sheep without, you know, especially once the official crash sort of happened in 91, because I know it took you until about 95 to disperse of the mob, without, you know, if a lot of people are doing it at that point in time with sheep just being worth absolutely nothing. Like I know at one point there was the flock reduction scheme where people were getting paid just to shoot the sheep instead.
We were involved in that at one stage. We shot about 5,000 sheep, I think.
That was terrible.
Yeah. The only thing we did, we rejuvenated a bit of bare country by taking portable yards out there and trucking sheep into these portable yards, shooting them all, take the yards away, and that rejuvenated a lot of that country because all the remains of the sheep.
Organic matter, yeah. Gosh, out of all the things in that period of time, what was the hardest? Was it that?
Shooting your own sheep.
Yeah, shooting your own sheep was difficult, but you had to make a decision that you were making the right decision, and therefore you've just got to go ahead and do it, and don't start thinking backwards. The moment you start thinking backwards, then you start to have problems with yourself. You make a forward decision, you stick with your forward decision.
How do you not in that same period of time though, get caught in a thought cycle of just being angry towards the people up top who have caused this situation, the people who held onto the stockpile? It would have been a relatively small group of people that now, your entire family, like legacy, your business model, all your genetics. How do you not then get caught up also just wanting to, take revenge?
You knew the problem and you knew the people, but there's no point in getting angry. There's no point in getting angry in a situation like that. You can only the only thing that you can use your brain power for is do the best thing you can for yourself. The moment you start getting angry, that takes part of your brain power out and directs it in the wrong direction. So we had to make the decisions we had to make, and we got the best advice we could when we made it. And I mean, one of the best things we ever did was a guy who came and sat at our dinner table one night. He was an agent in Queensland, in New South Wales, Queensland, that sort of thing, and he's the guy that arranged for us to buy the cattle stud.
How did it affect you though? You had been a sheep man your entire life, and your dad had been a sheep man before you.
Yep.
Lyndon had always been a sheep station.
Yep.
What was it like for you knowing that there was going to be such a big change on the station and that once the sheep are gone, that's it?
Yeah, I mean, put it this way, it does have an effect on you, that's for sure. But then basically, are you a person that's totally involved in a particular industry or a particular thing in life, or are you a business person? And if you're a business person, you take hard decisions. And, okay, it was a hard decision, taking the decision, there's no doubt about it. I mean, if wool prices in the next couple of years had gone through the roof, I'd have been kicking myself, wouldn't I? But these are the decisions you take. But the industry, Australian industry, was selling itself down the tube.
I mean, there would have been so much emotion involved at this time, but it sounds like you tried to take the emotion out of the decision.
Oh, well, you had to.
But that's easier said than done.
Oh, it is. There's no question about that. It's not an easy decision. But if you're a business person, do you want to be? I mean, I look back at that, and I think people that I saw that were sitting in 93, 94 on the bones of their bloody asses, didn't know what to do with the sheep that they had on the properties because none of us had taken the decision. But it wasn't that many years. I think it was by about 97, 98, there weren't a lot of sheep left north of the Gascoyne River because everybody's finally decided, well, they've got to go down that path. And that's when it gets hard, when you make that decision at the end of the period sort of thing. So as it turned out, from us, we were lucky I'd made that decision, I suppose.
Did you ever doubt yourself during that time?
Oh, yeah. You do wake up and, you hear a bit of news and somebody said, I got record prices for my wool today, and you thought, oh, geez, here I go. Yes, you do. No question about that. Yeah.
What was it like transitioning into cattle? You'd already had a small herd on Lyndon for quite some time, but now it was time to really upscale.
No, I didn't find it a problem. And I can't remember when, but about in the mid-'80s, because we always had a few cattle and that sort of thing. And there was a guy called Alan Bain. Alan was a mate of mine, that sort of thing. And so I said to Alan one period, I said, Alan, might have I come up when you're doing a bit of a muster over there at, Bluey, that, you're mustering cattle. Could I come across and do a bit of a muster with you on and learn a bit about cattle work and that sort of thing? So I did. I went over and spent a week with Alan, and I learned how to run cattle and how to look after cattle and how to draft cattle and how to do all those sorts of things. So having said that, we'd already been mustering cattle ourselves and that sort of thing. So, because we always had a few hundred there and probably up to 1,000 at times when the seasons were good and,
Was it hard to ask Alan to come and learn from him?
No.
You weren't too proud or anything?
No, God, no. No, that was something. And I've find whatever you're involved in life, if you change your mind and you want to go into a new industry, go and find the best person you know in that industry and ask them to, because I tell you what, people have done that to me when they want to learn something. I feel a bit of pride to be able to send that person home and say, yeah, well, he's learnt something from me, and I had no problem with that whatsoever. No, I think that is probably one thing that's worth learning out of all of this is use somebody else's skills to improve yours. The way things have turned out, and probably I'm not claiming to be smart about it, as things have turned out, we've probably made some of the best decisions that I could have made in life. I can't think back to where I've made a really bad decision. And I guess that's a bit of a luck of the draw as to what your personality is. I mean, it's very easy to get stitched up in an industry or in a thing in your life and refuse to change. Whereas if you can always see something better and you're in a position to be able to take advantage of it, do that. I think that's one of the big things. A lot of people in the industry get so involved in their own section of this, they were not prepared to look outside their industry to get perhaps a better idea. And I think I've been one of the fortunate people that I've always looked around and want to know how other people have operated. And if someone's done it better than me, we'll get in there and grab it. Chris and I were both on the bones of our backside when we bought Lyndon. We had no money. Neither of us had any money in our own right. If we hadn't made some drastic decisions and probably fairly risky decisions at times, we'd still be on that bones of our ass as we grow up. Whereas today, we sit pretty comfortably and we've got, friendships with people that we respect and they respect us. I don't know what else you'd need in life. I think we've done all the good things so we've been pretty lucky, Ari. And, you can say it's wisdom, but also there's a fair bit of luck involved too.
What about you, Chris?
I loved my years at Lyndon. I loved the challenges of not being able to cook I'm quite a good cook now. I love the challenges of being able to go out and get my own cleaning contracts, my own business running Four Seasons Wool, my own catering contracts, as well as the cleaning ones. So that was all a challenge. And the minute the kids went to school and I had a 6-hour school day free, I started to study about what I would do next, which was bookkeeping. So I really loved my years up there. But as Tim says, we're comfy here. We've got a nice new house and everything opens and closes with, just touch the drawers, they open and close. So it's good. Life's good.